Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the third day of the International Conference, Integral Human Development in the Digital Age. We are moving forward with our conference agenda for the day. And now I have a great honor to announce our next panel discussion devoted to integral human development, the pandemic, and the need for a new social ethics. This session will be delivered by the Notre University, a partner of this conference and a long-standing valued partner of Ukrainian Catholic University. I'm truly convinced then that in Keough Notre Dame partnership, we form the basis for friendship and solidarity and for empathy in service to human and society. So I'm now very pleased to welcome a moderator of this panel, our esteemed friend and colleague, Mr. Clemens Sedmak, Professor of Social Ethics and Interim Director of Nanovic Institute for European Studies, Keough School of Global Affairs. So, dear Clemens, a question of the year 2020. Do you hear me well?
I can hear you well.
Perfect.
I can hear you well.
Perfect. So I cordially invite you to take the floor now.
Thank you so much. Good morning from South Bend, Indiana. And solidarity. So my name is Clemens Sedmak, and as mentioned, I serve as Interim Director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies here at the Keough School at the University of Notre Dame. And I will be the moderator, which basically means I will be the timekeeper for the 1 hour that we have together. Integral human development is the defining motto of the Keough School of Global Affairs. We are so grateful that we have been asked to contribute to this conference on this very topic. Our panel today will offer an interdisciplinary discussion entitled Integral Human Development, the Pandemic, and the Need for a New Social Ethics. We have wonderful and distinguished panelists. I'm so grateful that I can introduce them to you in the order of their speaking slots. Dean Scott Appleby is the Marilyn Keough Dean of Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. He's the founding dean of this new school, the first new school at Notre Dame in nearly a century. Scott Appleby is a distinguished historian of religions with a PhD from the University of Chicago. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences. And he has built the Keough School around the idea of integral human development. And he has built the school from scratch. There was no building, no curriculum, no cohort of students, no global affairs faculty. And now we are talking in a busy building with colleagues and students about IHD. Welcome, my dean, and thank you so much for being with us. Julia Kowalski is an assistant professor of global affairs and a concurrent faculty member in Notre Dame's Gender Studies program. Julia is a wonderful colleague and teacher, respected and loved by all. A cultural anthropologist by training, Julia completed her PhD in the Department of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago. She has been conducting fieldwork in North India since 2007, focusing on issues of gender, kinship, women's rights, personhood, gendered violence, and everyday institutional practices. Professor Kowalski will bring her unique expertise and fieldwork experience to our discussion on integral human development. Thank you so much, Julia, for being with us, and welcome. Father Jim Lee, C.S.C, is a Holy Cross priest, a fellow of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, and currently the interim senior director for academic initiatives and partnerships for the University of Notre Dame London Global Gateway. He has also served at the University of Portland as an associate professor of psychology and at Stonehill College, where he served as vice president for mission. Father Jim holds a PhD in psychology from the University of Minnesota. A week ago, Father Jim Lees has been named interim president of the University of Portland, effective July 1st. Father Jim will bring an educational, psychological, and spiritual theological approach to integral human development to the panel. Thanks so much for joining us in this busy time, Father Jim. Professor Catherine Bolten is our fourth panelist. She's Associate Professor of Anthropology and Peace Studies. She earned her PhD from the Department of Anthropology at the University of Michigan. She has been working in Sierra Leone since 2003, focusing on issues of memory, poverty, morality, and post-war development. She also currently serves as Director of Doctoral Studies for the University of Notre Dame's Keough Institute for International Peace Studies, where she is a core faculty member. Kat Bolten has written two amazing books based on extensive field research. I Did It to Save My Life, Love and Survival in Sierra Leone, 2012, and Serious Youth in Sierra Leone with Oxford University Press, 2019. Professor Bolten will bring her research expertise, her commitment to human dignity, and her sharp intellect to our panel. Thank you so much, Kat, for being with us, and may your dog be free to bark if he so feels. The idea of the panel is straightforward. Each of the panelists will offer 5 to 8 minutes with an extra minute for the dean of opening remarks, and then we will enter discussion where we are also happy to work with questions from the audience. Please feel free to feed us questions through the chat function, and I will ask those questions to our distinguished panelists. We will end on time at 11 a.m. Eastern Time to respect people's busy schedules in the understanding that there is a life after the panel as much as there is a life after the pandemic, especially if we take integral human development seriously. Dear Dean Appleby, may I give the floor to you, and may I please ask you for your reflections. Thank you.
Thank you, Clemens. Let me add my greetings to our friends and colleagues at Ukrainian Catholic University and at Georgetown University and at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, the Angelicum. We are delighted to be a partner in this international conference on poverties, migrants, pandemics, and the idea of a new social ethics as part of your series of conferences on integral human development in the digital age, and here we are. So what then is integral human development? For the moment, let us define IHD as the state of a society in which the irreducible dignity of the human person and the cultural and spiritual, as well as economic and material human flourishing, are central to political and social life and upheld by the rule of law. Within this definition, we echo Catholic social teachings' affirmation of a preferential option for the poor, the marginalized, the most vulnerable in our societies. At the core of IHD is the conviction that the dignity of the human person is expressed in work and economic activity, but also in cultural richness, artistic creativity, religious belonging, and spiritual practice. Most profoundly, human dignity is expressed in our relationships with and obligations to nature, family, community, and ultimately to all of humanity. As Dean of a global affairs school that has made advancing IHD its mission, I must also ask, how can a university community contribute concretely to realizing this lofty vision? The pandemic has sharply focused our faculty's reflections on IHD and given them a practical urgency. And so we aspire to see the debilitating impact of the coronavirus from the perspectives of the besieged women, children, and workers most affected by it, to raise awareness of the radical changes now required in sensibility, lifestyle, and political economy, and to explore practical, concrete, achievable means of making these changes and thereby advancing integral human development. We have done so in part through our Dignity and Development blog series, which you can access on the events page on the Keough School website. There you will find approximately 60 essays of roughly 1,500 words each by scholars and practitioners of anthropology, peace studies, development, social ethics, theology, global health and global politics, the psychology of the family, and much, much more, all of whom address two questions. How does the lens of IHD illuminate and make a difference in how you conceptualize and conduct your work? And how might the pandemic offer new challenges, but also new opportunities for fostering a more just and equitable world IHD style. Perusing those 60 essays, you will find leanings toward a new post-pandemic social ethic. Nuggets like the following. Social entrepreneurship expert Michael Morris notes that during the pandemic, the poor have borne a disproportionate amount of the cost in terms of infections and death, scarcity, and vulnerability. Our ultimate principle as a society is a value for life, but we routinely make trade-offs, such as when we send soldiers to die for some cause, put firefighters in harm's way, or charge people money to get a flu shot, he writes. So what are the trade-offs we are willing to make in addressing a debilitating virus? How do we factor in the real cost to the most economically vulnerable in society? This is a discussion, Mike continues, we seem to avoid, but it is important that the trade-offs we have effectively made through our responses to this virus be acknowledged, explored, measured, and justified. It is difficult to make evidence-based decisions when we oversimplify decision options, ignore the diversity of society, and leave out major cost components. Development economist Alejandro Estefan takes the problem to scale by noting that developing countries face three key challenges to overcome that are absent in advanced economies: lack of access to international credit markets, labor informality and exploitation, and stunning drops in the price of the goods and services workers provide. Exploring remedies, Estefan suggests that low-cost technologies could improve the lot of the working poor. Online higher education is perhaps the single most beneficial revolution that could come out of COVID-19, he writes. The crisis has a disproportionately detrimental effect on low-skilled workers, and technological progress threatens to erase many of the jobs that require only secondary education. Online higher education may provide an affordable alternative for low-income individuals. Engineer Tracy Kajewska-Korea notes that COVID-19 has proven expertly equipped to do what disasters do best: highlight vulnerabilities in systems, processes, and infrastructure, whether they be physical, social, or economic, particularly those we had long chosen to ignore. She warns against complacency. Quote, disaster risk reduction practitioners, myself included, routinely advocate for sunny day decisions. That is, please let us invest proactively in addressing systemic vulnerabilities and reducing exposure in order to protect communities before the storm. Both measures help mitigate the risk of hazards like hurricanes, earthquakes, and even global pandemics. The pandemic, she hopes, may bring home the fact that every dollar spent in proactive mitigation against natural hazards can save up to $11 in prevented losses of life, property, services, livelihoods, and mental well-being, all ingredients of IHD. Finally, policy scholar David Courtwright, while lamenting the many offenses against IHD of the Trump administration policies, also sees in the pandemic unprecedented international cooperation among technicians and scientists in multiple countries as they share data and findings in the search for a coronavirus vaccine and more effective testing and treatment. We also see increasing recognition over the last year of global interdependence and calls for greater internationalism, as Pope Francis and others have observed COVID-19, quote, knows no borders and can only be contained through coordinated global action. The UN Secretary General, leading economists have called upon greater measures to expand lending for developing nations and the poor and to support low-income workers. Courtwright asks, can we envision a post-COVID-19 shift toward improved global governance, a rebirth of internationalism to strengthen our defenses against pandemics, to protect the dignity and development needs of all people, especially the most vulnerable? Well, as I conclude, this is just a sampling of the richness of insight on display in the Dignity and Development blog series, to which every one of us on this panel has contributed, save one. So, Father Jim, we expect your 1,500-word essay within the next week. And so you ask of IHD, pandemics, and a new social ethic. My reply, recalls the laconic response of Mircea Eliade when an unsuspecting University of Chicago undergraduate strolled into his office one day many years ago and asked the great historian of religion, please, to, quote, summarize the themes of your work. Young man, he replied, go read my books. When you have finished, come back and we'll talk. Professor Eliade, by that point, had written 60 books, not 60 blogs, but the principle still applies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you also for advertising the blog. Dean Volodymyr Tonikovsky also contributed to the blog. We are grateful for that as an expression of our friendship with the Ukrainian Catholic University. And now the floor is open for Professor Kowalski. Julia, please fire away. Thank you.
So hello, everyone can hear me, I hope.
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Great, wonderful. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. And like Dean Appleby, I will extend my thanks to Clemens for inviting me to participate on this panel and to our hosts at this conference. So I'm going to build a bit on what Scott has already said about integral human development and the pandemic by sharing some insights that come via my own anthropological research on how gender and kinship have informed development processes around the globe. And, in the spirit rather than talking about the findings from my field work with you all, I'm going to talk about some of the insights that this comparative work has led me to within the United States, insights that the pandemic has really underscored, I think, for many of us. So in my understanding of this complex concept, integral human development, this approach invites us to consider what it means to be a developed human in a context that gives our lives meaning and purpose. Because development carries so many multiple meanings, this concept invites us to think across scales, considering everything from the scale of international development, but also the scale of individual development from infancy to old age. And so not only for scholars of human development and other topics, but I think for many of us through visceral lived experience, the pandemic has really called into question assumptions about individualism and independence that are at the heart of mainstream expectations about development in both societal and individual terms. And these are expectations that are supported and enforced by a range of powerful institutional actors, both within the United States, where I am speaking from, and around the world. So just a few small examples, assumptions about the importance of national sovereignty and independence at an international scale, especially as a frame for economic development, has been called into acute question by a pathogen that does not care about boundaries. It doesn't matter if we vaccinate at a national scale if across the border there's a population that can't fully vaccinate due to resource restrictions. At a slightly more local scale, the pandemic has made visible the precarious infrastructure that had allowed caregivers, particularly women, to participate simultaneously in productive and reproductive labor. That is, to earn a wage outside of the household, while also fulfilling unpaid expectations about caregiving for children and elders at home. We now realize the enormous economic and political importance of the infrastructure of intergenerational family care, because this infrastructure collapsed spectacularly as a result of social distancing measures. The impacts of this collapse in the United States, particularly for women who experience intersecting oppressions due to class, race, and gender, are already clear. Data on unemployment in the United States at the end of 2020, for example, showed that nearly all of the jobs that the economy had lost in that period of time were lost by women. And most of all women of color who frequently work in undervalued fields such as home health care and the service industry. So a system that was built to recognize workers only as abstract, independent individuals has shown itself to be unable to cope when all of the various forms of invisible labor that sustained such independence suddenly surge into view. Along these lines, the pandemic has revealed other less obvious ways that this fixation on independence might impede more integral understandings of human development, in this case at the scale of the individual. So for example, in the United States, there has been enormous controversy over whether or not residential colleges should reopen to host students in person for classes and to house them in the dorms where they all live so very close together. So much of the public debate about this decision focused on difficult questions about the economics of education, the epidemiology of COVID, and the value of face-to-face learning, all really important questions for us to address. But underneath these concerns is another set of issues that are rarely openly discussed in the United States, which is that the pandemic threatens valued pathways to adulthood, especially for the relatively elite families who send their children to private four-year colleges. So this specter of children learning, or college students learning in their parents' basements, threatens a valued path to adulthood by making it more difficult for students to cultivate independence in a socially recognized manner that requires them to separate from their households of origin and live warehoused in an institutional space. And I know I'm speaking to an international audience, and so I will pause here and recognize that this is not a model that shapes how people think about college outside of the US in the same way that it does within the US, of course. So the pandemic, in other words, has profoundly threatened American scripts for what a developmentally appropriate pathway into adulthood should look like. And indeed, policies and practices regulate the relationship between spatial independence, whether that's college students in a dorm or aging adults living at home, sustained by home healthcare aides. So these policies and practices regulate this relationship between spatial independence and personhood across the life course. But they often obscure the complex interdependent relationships that actually sustain such seemingly independent lives. So I think that as we think about a new social ethics, the pandemic really invites us to reflect on how these fault lines and desires for independent, autonomous personhood might bring into view the multiple modalities of risk that are at stake in producing seemingly independent persons. So the pandemic invites us and really forces us to ask, how might we better recognize and honor the relations that sustain our seeming independence, whether that's at the scale of the individual, the state, or the nation? The kind of dignity that we talk about when we talk about integral human development is a relational achievement. It's something that we rely on relations with others to achieve. And as the pandemic has reshaped American life in ways large and small, it underscores the extent to which this individual personhood model fails to really fully and richly account for those forms of relationality. And in turn, turning our gaze to interdependent relations can really broaden our ability to imagine more sustaining futures. So as I said at the start of my talk here, I come at these issues as a cultural anthropologist. And one insight that anthropology, along with other disciplines in the social sciences, brings us is that, comparative work can teach us that other worlds are possible and other modalities for organizing society are possible, in part because they already exist. And so to end on a positive note, one thing that the pandemic has also underscored is the rich and vital social movements in the US and around the world that are already organizing around questions of how to sustain and nurture and value interdependence. So I will pass things back to Clemens.
Thank you so much, Julia, for your reminders of what the pandemic told us and taught us. The Big Reveal was the title of the first blog by Dean Appleby. And also ending on a positive note, we really appreciate that. And now we hope for some more positive notes from Father Jim Lees. Please, Reverend, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Clemens, and greetings all. I'm delighted to be a part of this esteemed panel, and I want to thank all the sponsors of this conference. I'm particularly delighted to connect, albeit virtually, with the Ukrainian University, Catholic University, where I've had the pleasure to visit and participate in a previous conference sponsored by the Nanovic Institute. It's a pleasure to see so many familiar faces. My work for Notre Dame takes place in London during ordinary times, and as these are not ordinary times, I'm currently living on the main campus. But in London, Notre Dame has a team of about 20 women and men on the staff who work for what we call the London Global Gateway, which is the headquarters for the work of the university in the UK. When the pandemic struck and our staff immediately proceeded to work from home and I returned to work from campus, there was a sudden inevitable rethinking of the normal structures of our activity and the immediacy with which we might expect things to be produced or accomplished. Suddenly it wasn't productivity or outcomes that was first on our minds. It was quite simply a focus on the health and well-being of each of the individual members of our team. We in leadership were suddenly asking, how will each manage, particularly those with children or elderly parents living in? How will it work as their homes become their new workplaces? What kind of capacity will they have? Do they have any family or friends to whom they may need to attend beyond their own? And do they have those who can attend to their needs? Questions I'm embarrassed to say we would typically not have asked. It was suddenly a dramatic reorientation to the human person and their respective circumstances. It was quite simply at the heart of the question of integral human development. It may not have run as broadly or deeply as the ideal, but it was truly a reorientation. In his excellent article on the Keough's Dignity and Development blog, Patrick Calderon makes a broader analysis of this reorientation on a national and global level and the respective responses in the wake of it. Our government and other nations are providing subsidies and stimulus monies to assist those who are hungry or who might otherwise lose their homes, their jobs, their businesses, leaving us to wonder, given the human need that existed before the pandemic, why wasn't this happening already? In Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis says, and I quote, "The pandemic momentarily revived the sense that we are a global community, all in the same boat, where one person's problems are the problems of all. Once more, we realize that no one is saved alone. We can only be saved together." Quote. The interesting result of the global pandemic is that there seems to be a sudden awareness of human need, and more than that, an awareness of the urgency of addressing it. I am not an economist or a politician, but this past year has clearly made us all rethink our assumptions. How do we maintain the stability of our micro ecosystems, the worlds in which we live, and more broadly, our political and economic order, as businesses are struggling and folks are suddenly losing their homes and livelihoods? Suddenly, the attention of the efforts of those who study such things, and practitioners and politicians who are in a position to affect them, has led to a recognition that we need to attend to and enhance the human. There is a sudden appreciation that life comes before profit, as Calderon says, which should also guide us in normal times. My area of research has been in the realms of moral psychology. How do we reason to the good, even secularly and societally determined? Why, when we know what the good is, do we often fail to do it or choose not to? It's a curious thing that the pandemic has caused some people who have long known of the adverse conditions that people experience and didn't feel as great a need to attend to it then do now. Or at least they didn't appreciate the urgency that seemed to now. Moral psychology also attempts to assess levels of moral reasoning, with the emphasis not so much on what we choose, but why we choose it, why we choose to do what we do, in the vein of Kohlberg's theory. I might hope that the pandemic has changed perspectives and perhaps hearts so as to suddenly have all of us understanding the importance of the pursuit of integral human development, but I fear not. It may indeed be that for some in positions of power and influence and authority, that they may be doing what we might call the right thing, but for the wrong reason. In up those who are poor is in the interests of the rich and the powerful and the well-positioned. And I don't want to be cynical here, but it may be that they just don't want their world to fall apart or our economic order to crumble. And yet clearly we hope that at the same time they have a growing appreciation for the effectiveness of their actions, not only in holding the world together, so to speak, but also in safeguarding the lives and livelihoods of every human person. From Fratelli Tutti again, and I quote, "We cannot fail to mention that seeking and pursuing the good of others and of the entire human family also implies helping individuals and societies to mature in the moral values that foster integral human development." End quote. It is this movement toward a new social ethics that would have us reflect on the moral dimensions of social structures and systems, issues, and communities. Radically change the thinking of many, whether in leadership on various levels and realms or in our own homes and parishes and families. This is where education around integral human development becomes so important. From Fratelli Tutti again, I would especially like, quote, "I would like especially to mention solidarity, which as a moral virtue and social attitude born of personal conversion, calls for commitment on the part of those responsible for education and formation," end quote. The potential venues for this education and formation are vast, particularly in our Catholic colleges and universities throughout the world, as Dean Appleby mentioned earlier. In London, we offer a course for our undergraduates visiting from Notre Dame, which I co-teach, called the Catholic Social Teaching in the Charitable Sector. It's a course which requires each student to participate in an internship at a nonprofit in Greater London, which attends to some aspect of human need. And the classroom portion focuses on UST and integral human development as the foundational motivation for an institution like Notre Dame to promote and pursue such activities. There are other venues as well. One on a slightly broader scale might be seen in Fratelli Tutti itself, or in Cardinal Turkson's talks around the world, but certainly at the United Nations gathering in Geneva in 2017 on integral human development. Or closer to home in London, Anna Rowlands, a theologian and C.S.C. scholar affiliated with the Center for Catholic Studies at Durham University, who provides regular programs for members of the British Parliament on matters related to C.S.C. and IHD. Perhaps one of the most impressive adopters of integral human development in the educational realm is the Keough School right here at Notre Dame, which has at its heart the mission of the advancement of IHD through research and policy and practice across a collection of 9 centers and institutes representing an array of disciplines. It's been said, but it is a powerful opportunity to further deepen conversations and education around this important topic. And I'll end with an urging that we find new and creative ways to promote IHD. On the topic ourselves in our living integral human development in our lives and in our homes and our families and in our parish and civic communities. It is our charge and our challenge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father Jim, also for reminding us of the role and potential and responsibility of Catholic institutions, Catholic universities, and helping us to rethink the moral dimension of our institutions. Professor Bolton, Chet, we are so looking forward to your contribution. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Clemens, and thank you everyone for joining this panel. I have 2 unenviable tasks. One is following all of these fabulous presenters, and the second was given to me explicitly by Clemens. He said, could you connect the micro and macro? Is this sort of code for you have trouble disciplining your thinking, so what's on your mind? So I'm going to do my best to connect with the thinking that I've been doing about COVID and my own research in Sierra Leone, which will actually come in at the end. And the way that these comments are going to be structured is the fact that I'm a scholar of structural violence. So I attempt to seek out the hidden abode of suffering and where the pandemic has revealed prejudices that already existed but were otherwise normalized and accepted in society. So COVID has revealed more precisely the assumptions about whose lives matter more that govern decision-making around healthcare around the world. So these assumptions are unsurprisingly ageist, they're racist, they're classist, and they're also ableist, but they're also deeply nationalist. With this moment more than any other, revealing what we call the me before you attitude that governs the global North's approach of establishing an ethical stance that judges us not just on the number of people who live or die, but the fact that we don't sacrifice the most vulnerable to this disease. So in the early days of the pandemic, it was revealed that there was an ethic of care that explicitly prioritized otherwise young, healthy people in a way that made it clear that normal people whose lives were threatened, so-called normal people, were prioritized for care over those that were disabled or immunocompromised and already sick. And I'll just give you some examples of how this unfolded. So in March 2020, a hospital corporation in California suspended prescriptions of hydroxychloroquine to people with autoimmune disorders. This was when hydroxychloroquine was still touted as a possible cure for COVID. And in their letters to these people, they were not asked if they wanted to suspend their prescriptions. They were thanked for their sacrifice of these drugs so that they could be used instead on COVID patients, as though a drug were more important for an unproven experimental use on quote unquote normal people than it was for a proven use on those who already needed it. In that same month, Cuomo secretly moved elderly COVID patients who were deemed stable from their hospital wards back into their nursing homes to free up bed space, even when these patients were still actively sick with COVID. And this assumption was based on the fact that a younger or newer COVID case took precedence over someone who was already ill simply because of their age. Slightly later in the pandemic in the United Kingdom, the National Health Service gave automatic do not resuscitate orders to COVID patients who were diagnosed with learning disabilities. This means that people with Down syndrome and other similar conditions were 30 times more likely to die of COVID than normal patients. The shocking fact is that this decision was made in the second lockdown, not the first, which means that the National Health Service learned to prioritize cognitively normal people after the first wave. So the question that kind of arises from this is, why would keep compromised from dying? The question is really whose dignity and on what basis that dignity is supported and protected. A second wave of this thinking with respect to structural violence came with the expectation of sacrifice from those deemed essential workers, which signals an explicit acknowledgement of social inequality and an expectation that because low-wage jobs are in constant demand, that these individuals can be easily replaced. Now, I don't know how many of you ever watch, mainstream TV, but what we called lockdown TV was flooded with advertisements from fast food companies, grocery stores, and other locally serving businesses stating that we are here to keep you safe, as though the only people locking down are white-collar people who can work remotely, and it is the work of essential workers to keep the middle class safe, and that this is the new normal, as though solidifying the idea of a completely bifurcated world is the sacrifice that is expected of low-wage workers. These same essential workers have not been given priority for vaccines in any state. After healthcare workers were vaccinated, only an age gradient of vaccination was established, as though any 65-year-old is more in need of a vaccine than a grocery store clerk or a bus driver, that one can be simultaneously essential and expendable. In California, essential workers were reclassified away from frontline workers in the early days of vaccine distribution and still do not have access to vaccines. On a global scale, vaccine distribution reveals global inequalities more shockingly than any other metric for understanding the threat to human dignity that COVID revealed, not that it caused. So the WHO that 75% of the 128 million vaccines that have been distributed thus far were distributed in only 10 countries, with almost 130 countries comprising 2.5 billion people yet to get a single dose of vaccine. So this is the squeakiest wheel getting the grease, with the countries that can leverage the most money for their own people getting the vaccines and willingly ignoring the rest. And I'm also particularly obsessed with the national and international registers of COVID cases and COVID dead. And this is because these hide much more than they reveal. So the people listed as COVID deaths on these websites are actually we don't actually know how many people have died of COVID, because the ones that we have seen on these registers received a positive test before they died, which means that some standard of care was made available to them that is not already made available to the vast majority of the world's population. So we cannot even contemplate how many silent deaths are occurring around the world because there's simply no way for most people to get tested, no way for them to go to the hospital, and if they get there, no way for them to pay for their care. A research project that I'm initiating this year in South Bend is actually looking at the sort of hidden abode of the cost of COVID for the homeless population and for undocumented immigrants in South Bend. How has COVID affected them in ways that we don't know because we haven't actually bothered to shine a light in their direction? I actually started a COVID study in Sierra Leone when COVID reached Sierra Leone in April of last year. But I had to stop it after only 3 months because compared to the diseases that actually threaten people in Sierra Leone, COVID is a very minor concern. So to get worked up about a disease that kills only 3% of those who get sick. Their children die every day of dehydration, diarrhea, preventable diseases. They themselves die of malaria and typhoid, which will kill you if you cannot afford the $2 for standard treatment. And this really begs the question about our own obsession with COVID related to the global South, especially places in Africa like Sierra Leone, which rank very low on the Human Development Index, which is a question. Why should countries with extremely high infant and mortality and maternal mortality rates care about COVID? Why should countries in the 50s care about COVID? It is actually a luxury that our dignity is not assaulted so regularly by infectious disease and non-existent healthcare that we have the luxury of worrying about a disease with 3% mortality. I'm kind of in the habit of unpopular opinions and shining a light in these deeply uncomfortable ways, but these are sort of my primary takeaways from COVID at the moment. And I thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much, Kat, also for taking us out of a North American European perspective. Thank you, dear panelists. Having listened to you, I have 5 big takeaways, and obviously many more, but my 5 big takeaways are: number 1, the pandemic is a big reveal, fragility of our vulnerability of people, and the message some lives matter more than others, both on a national and on a global level. Words like essential workers and more vulnerable people come to mind. Secondly, a disruption of the script for being a person in the society and for growing up, and a necessity to rethink the way we interact with each other. Thirdly, new insights into interdependence and interconnectedness, a relational understanding of the person, and a role of solidarity is necessary now. Fourthly, we need to invest in resilience and a new internationalism. And fifthly, we should make use of the opportunity to reorient ourselves, ask the why questions with a special responsibility for Catholic institutions, make sure that life comes before profit, and trust that other worlds are not only possible but also partly exist. Friends, we have 18 minutes, I would say 17 minutes for questions and comments. As you have seen in the chat, Vice Rector Tara Stopko has put a question to Dean Appleby. How would you relationship between the concepts of IHD and the common good? I think I'll just ask this question in a very succinct way, Scott, please.
Thank you for the question, a terrific question. What is the common good of the person in community would be one way to phrase the question. What is the common good when we, not only the individual, but in Catholic social teaching, the individual is always embedded in community. IHD helps us elaborate what those who are daily defining the common good in practice, that is, public officials, legislators, bureaucrats, NGO managers, religious leaders, they're always constantly struggling with what does it mean to implement the common good. IHD suggests what they must take into account. That is the whole person. So we talked about all of the different dimensions of the person, and so we avoid reductionism, that the person is only a consumer or a producer or a believer or whatever it may be. So it's the whole person that must be taken into account. And also IHD, again, specifies the common good, that we must take into account the situated contexts of all persons, which are very different. And all of our societies are beset by challenges to IHD, but they can be, as you've heard from Kat Bolton and others, they can be quite specific to a particular society. Thus, when we talk about integral human development, we trade a bit on the word integral, stretching it to include not only the whole person who is one integrated individual, but also to the need approach to problems, so that when we address the common good, we recognize that it's not only the politicians, the economists, or the ethicists, or the anthropologists, but really a phenomenon like a pandemic affects health and governance and human rights and so much, so that we take an integrated approach to serving the common good of the human person. Finally, I'll say The question was also about the relationship between IHD and common good and other parts of Catholic social tradition. These are all organically connected. As you know, the Pope is such a fan of IHD and such a proponent of the major Vatican dicastery, Integral Human Development. And so I will, here we do value family, as I mentioned, IHD, and one door down actually, is my brother-in-law who directs the Center for Social Concerns. So I'll stroll down after this and say, Bill, would you put IHD on your website along with the common good? So you'll see a change in that soon. Thanks for the great question.
Thank you, Dean Appleby. Kat, could you please take Mike Talbot's question? And before that, can you read through that? And meanwhile, I would ask Julia, could you take the second question about IHD operational principles? Is this question about what difference does IHD make, on the ground and in practice? Would you have any insights also from your field work that you could share? And while Julia gives us her insights, Kat can read Mike Talbot's complicated question and prepare a response. Julia, please.
Thanks, Clemens. Yeah, I feel a little put on the spot.
I know. I'm put on the spot.
In terms of operationalizing anthropology. But I do think that one thing that we could think about in terms of in order to solve a problem, you first have to determine and frame what kind of a problem it is. And I think one of the things that we see, especially in economizing approaches to public policy, is that problems are often framed at the scale of the individual or the family, and that makes it enormously difficult to solve problems that exceed those scales. And there's lots of examples of this within and across national borders. And so I think one way to operationalize these insights from IHD is to search for different and better ways to problematize the issues that we face in a manner that doesn't cut our gaze off at the boundaries of the self or the boundaries of the household. So to go back to this example of care and care work, in the United States, as in many developed countries, care work is understood as a private issue to be resolved by individual households. In reality, every individual household relies on a pretty wide infrastructure to kind of get care work done. In the United States, this is enormously challenging and expensive. And one kind of reason for the sustained inability of the United States, I think, to deal with these issues is an inability to understand society beyond the scale of the household. So I think one way to operationalize all of this is to think really deeply about that first step. So before you solve a problem, you have to think about and define what kind of problem is this. And integral human development, I think Dean Appleby put really well, these different valences of the word integral, I think encourages us to take a slightly wider gaze and to think about and perhaps better listen to social movements that are already doing this thinking about how to recognize problems that extend beyond individualistic or household level issues.
Thank you, Julia. Great thinking on your feet. That's why we put you on a panel rather than on the spot. Thank you. So we have this question from Mike Talbot, which is basically about the disparity between resource-rich and resource-poor countries. And the question is there a healthcare debt that we owe to those in resource-poor countries as well as marginalized communities within our own countries? And Kat has touched upon these disparities in her talk a little bit. Please, Kat.
So I actually love this question, Mike. I think this is a vitally important question because what it leads us to talk about is not necessarily just moral solidarity or self-interest, but indeed, there is no wealth anywhere in the world that was not earned somewhat unfairly on the backs of others, whether this is racial and class disparities in the US or the terrible legacy of colonialism around the world. We owe that wealth and therefore we owe that health care. And I think moral solidarity actually kind of undermines the fact that this debt is owed. This is not a benevolent be kind of taken towards the developing world because that's still very condescending and paternalistic. The entire wealth of the North was built on the backs of the South, and it was built on the backs of the marginalized in our own communities, and therefore that debt is owed.
Thank you so much, Kat. I got a question which I think I will direct to Father Jim. It's about the role of Catholic universities in building a post-pandemic new social ethics. As most of you know, the Nanovic Institute for European Studies established a Catholic University partnership, where Ukrainian Catholic University is an important member and partner. Notre Dame International is trying to build a Catholic Universities Consortium. And Father Jim, as I mentioned, is now our president of a Catholic university. Do you have any insights on the role of Catholic in universities when it comes to these post-pandemic ethical challenges?
Thank you. I do see a vital role for our institutions. Everyone takes up these questions differently, and I admit I'm a psychologist, so typically focused on the individual, not a social ethicist. But I will say I do think in our institutions, to Julia's earlier point, a lot of these questions are swirling around in society. So I wouldn't even limit it to our Catholic institutions. But if we don't recognize that some of the movements and the sort of the radical justice movements that's happening, the reckoning that has to happen, the Black Lives Matter movement, all of them are addressing some of the very issues that are at the heart of this. So I think the challenge for us as Catholic institutions is to recognize that we need not be siloed, but that we can be conveners of a conversation that is really important. I think what impresses me so much about the Keough School's mission is that it boldly takes on something that is quite obviously Catholic, and Scott will often say that much of this language, though we claim it, is broadly considered in other traditions and religions. But that's impressive, and I think Catholic institutions need to be about the business of gathering people of different perspectives and of different points of view around this issue. But we can be the place where that happens, and I hope we are.
Thank you, Father Jim. We got a question from Sofia Opatska, and I would leave it open to our esteemed panelists who wants to take this question. It's about the challenges for the students and the challenges students are facing over the last year. Can we do a better job even during these difficult times for our students? What can it be? How can we best support our students? Anyone from the panel, just unmute yourselves and fire away.
I will say,
Father Jim, please.
I'm on a team of, we realized once our students came and they were, struggling in quarantine and isolation, that they needed more attention than we were able to give them. Food is one thing, adequate shelter is fine, but it became evident very quickly. And so we put together a team of people who do pastoral calling, and we call each student a couple of days after they enter, and then we open a dialogue if they wish to, carry on. So that's one of the ways in which we've seen the importance of addressing that very issue.
Thank you. Any other insights? At Notre Dame, we try, I think, very hard to help our students and support them.
Something that I discovered from a sociologist at Notre Dame who works on social networks is that the average person over the age of 25 generally makes sort of meaningful, sustained contact with a total of 8 people over the course of one day. For someone between the ages of 18 and 25, that number is 21 people. This is a profound crisis of mental health for young people who need that kind of meaningful, sustained interaction with many people in order to live a healthy life. And that's something that we definitely somehow need to find a way to address.
Thank you so much, Kate. I didn't know that. So that's really, yeah. We have, let's say, 5 minutes left, 6 minutes left. Is there any panelist who would like to ask a question to the other panelists? Maybe Dean Appleby, you have a chance to talk to esteemed colleagues before they run off to their respective duties.
What questions may I pose to our colleagues? Here's a question, and this is a question for universities, our partners in this conversation. We struggle with this a bit, or we grapple with it. How do we integrate IHD into the curriculum? We've, I think, come some way in the Keough School with our faculty using this term. If there are 60 faculty now at the Keough School, there maybe are 75 different views of what IHD means and how it might be applied. So how do we address this within the higher educational structure, and especially in our courses?
Thank you, Scott. This goes nicely together with what I will call the last question for this panel, which we just got. And the question is, when we talk about development, The term seems, along with progress, confusing. Are we aiming at unending development and progress? Don't we need to limit our desire for progress as our present models of development and progress result in many people and species in danger? So the question to the higher ed responsibility connected with this question about the development in IHD. Maybe, well, I don't want to put anyone on spot now. I'm a little traumatized, but I would be tempted to ask Julia again, but I don't. Maybe Scott.
I'll say one thing while people are composing smarter responses, which is, the classroom, the professor is sovereign in the classroom. And so we don't present a list of points to make about IHD in any class, other than the seminar on IHD, which Clemens teaches for our graduate students and our undergraduates, that all of them take to be introduced to the concept. But I was heartened by an anecdote a couple of years ago when precisely this question about development and growth was raised by one of our master's students in a class on development economics taught by our terrific colleague Lakshmi Iyer. And this student raised her hand and said, well, is growth always a good thing? Economists seem to, and Lakshmi paused and opened up the conversation about that. And that to me was, just a great moment where the student body felt comfortable raising a moral, ethical question about economics in this case. And she was terrific in having a discussion about it. So that was one way. That's one great way to.
Thank you.
To do that.
Thank you, Scott. We are already moving towards the final statements, and then now I really have to call on people. We still have Scott's question, and we also got a question, do you think that the COVID pandemic and its effects on the world will weaken the recent rise of populist politics around the world? So maybe I start with Father Jim, then I would ask Julia for her statement and reflection, and then we end with Kat, where we had our last panelist. Father Jim.
Thank you. I think I would want to say that then the question of development being this ongoing phenomenon, I do think we will ever be on our way to the kingdom. And so we will always be struggling to get this right. And so I think the word is rather wisely chosen because we're going to be on our way. And please God, it will be ever better for the effort that people make, but it's going to be a challenge. I think I'll leave my comments at that and turn it over to.
Thank you, Father Jim. Professor Kowalski, if I may.
So I'm not an expert in populist politics around the world, but it is something I have been watching with great alarm in my own country, as I'm sure we all have. One thing that I will say is that to bring this conversation back to questions about gender and care, I think one thing that we see in populist politics is a kind of twofold reaction to shifts in gender labor and the economy. So one thing that we see is a sort of, so some scholars have argued that the rise of populism around the world is actually a response to the increasing feminization of the economy and what it values. We could spend a whole conference panel debating that insight, but I think there's something there. And so on the one hand, kind of understanding the ways in which and the effects of these shifts, for example, in the United States, from a manufacturing economy to an economy where the working class wears scrubs, has really kind of prompted a lot of these anxieties, precisely because we have these very deeply gendered ideas about who is good at what. So on the one hand, I think gender matters in that way and could shape how we think about the impact of the pandemic on these kinds of politics in the future. I would also say that another kind of effect of populism and populist politics has been to, well, maybe I'll leave it there, actually, because I don't want to take up too much of it.
Thank you, Julia.
Yeah.
Kat, you have the last word, but no need to summarize anything, right? Just no need. Just make the observation on those open questions.
I actually teach a course called The Cult of Personality, which is about political charisma. And we have addressed many different types of leaders over the years. The last time I taught the course in fall 2017, we addressed Trump for the first time. And at that point, the students still weren't sure that he was a charismatic, but that he did express a particular emotional hold on people. Now, I was reading about the aftermath of the Capitol riots again this morning because I can't seem to stay away from it. And what they found found is that 90% of the people who entered the Capitol were actually, oddly, small business owners. And that was the one thing that they all had in common. And that populist politics might be this notion of being squeezed from all sides. You were not the wealthy elite who was already prioritized to receive that kind of attention as marginal. You are in this liminal middle position, and that's where populism is coming from.
Thank you, Kat. Dear panelists, we are at time. We have 1 minute or 30 seconds left. Generous sharing of your wisdom, expertise, and insights, and for responding to our questions. I would just like to add that yesterday in our IHD class, we talked about the connection between understanding vulnerability and respecting the dignity of people. And having a deep sense of our own vulnerability and the vulnerability of others would be, I think, the building block for a new social ethics. Thank you, dear Ukrainian Catholic University, for inviting us to host a panel here from the University of Notre Dame. Thank you, dear friends from... And please, back to Lviv for you to end this panel. Thank you so much. Obviously, I'm confused now. Am I the last speaker? So am I to say now goodbye and live well and enjoy the rest of your lives? Okay, I do that. So thank you so much for having us. And thank you for all those who made this possible, also the technological support people. Thank you, Dean Appleby. Thank you, Father Jim. Thank you, Julia. And thank you, Kat. And as I said, enjoy the rest of the day and the rest of your lives. God bless you all. Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Sedmak, for your wonderful and very time-accurate moderation. And a special thanks to our honorable panelists for very insightful speeches and for the very interesting and inspiring deliberation. Thank you very much. It was truly and a true blessing to have you with us today. Thank you.